And you're live, Clive.
It's 5:05 and welcome into a Thursday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good morning to you. Well, lawmakers in the North Carolina General Assembly continue to target diversity, equity, and inclusion programs in state government and public universities. This, of course, a broader initiative that is taking place nationally by Republicans from Washington, D.C. to the North Carolina legislature. Yesterday, it was the state Senate that voted to ban DEI in community colleges and the public universities statewide throughout the UNC system. The state house was scheduled for a second straight day to vote to ban DEI in all state and local agencies, but that vote was delayed for a second day. The vote in the Senate came down along party lines, not necessarily any surprise there, with Republicans in support and Democrats opposing the DEI ban. Senator Brad Overcash, the Republican out of Gaston County, said during debate yesterday on the Senate floor, quote, "In recent years, discriminatory practices and divisive concepts have entered into our institutions of higher learning. They've divided our campuses, they've divided our student bodies, and they have divided our faculties." Supporters of the DEI ban say that they aren't opposed to diversity in general. They just don't think that state government should have formal pro-diversity training programs for employees or any sort of quotas or other DEI policies that involve decisions surrounding hiring, acceptance, or promotion. Democrat politicians and other critics, however, say that DEI policies don't encourage that discrimination, but rather help avoid it. Senator Greg Meyer, the Democrat out of Orange County, said, quote, "The work of diversity, equity, and inclusion is talking the actions to ensure that every person, meaning inclusion, no matter who they are, meaning diversity, is given what they need to be successful. That's equality. The best leaders frame all of their work through the lens that reinforces those three values." Some other quotes out of the GA. Senator Val Applewhite, the Democrat out of Cumberland County, went further, saying that she said supporters of the bill are motivated by fear and desire to lock in power and influence for people in North Carolina as the state becomes more diverse, saying, quote, "It's fear. Let's call it what it really is. This bill is a desperate attempt to lock in power before it shifts, to silence the truth, to erase the past, and close the door on all futures that includes all of us." Some pretty strong comments there from some senators in the North Carolina General Assembly. However, without any sort of political grandstanding, the vote did pass along party lines, all Republicans voting in favor of it, all Democrats voting against it. We'll have some more details on this legislation and the bill in the House that has been delayed now 2 days in a row coming up here in just a few minutes. It's now 5:08. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. We are continuing to track audits this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour. We've got a new one this morning out of the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services. To walk us through those details this morning, Teresa Opeka, CarolinaJournal.com, joins us. Teresa, I'm looking at the headline here, $106.5 million worth of federal funding that wasn't adequately monitored over at HHS. What's going on there?
Sure. Good morning, Nick. Thanks for having me. So, yeah, that's a pretty big number. It's coming out of the North Carolina Office of State Auditor's 2024 statewide single audit. And they focused in on the Health and Human Services, where they didn't adequately monitor that $106.5 million in federal funding. And it was passed to sub-recipients for providing substance abuse prevention, treatment, and recovery services, and also addressing the opioid abuse crisis. They also, another figure too, they questioned over 21,000 in medical assistance program, better known as Medicaid payments the department made to providers. It was based on inaccurate information eligibility determination. So some stuff to break down there. There's a little bit more as well. Regarding that inadequate monitoring, so what it says here is the division, they didn't complete monitoring activities and on-site visits for visits that include for Medicaid direct beneficiaries. And they also there was more when they broke down the numbers. It says some of these also it was for local management entity managed care organization, LME, MCO, and financial assistance contract entities. They received 40.4 million in substance abuse funds and 37.5 million in opioid abuse funds. So they went through all of that. They didn't adequately monitor all of those. And as the auditor's office says, inadequate monitoring increases the risk federal funds may not be used according to what the federal government requires. And they may have to, send some of that money back. This was also a recurring finding. It was previously reported in the 2023 statewide single audit. So, a lot of that stuff going on. It's also a repeated problem. And they said, the department says, yep, they are making other changes. They're working on some things and providing additional training. But again, we mentioned yesterday with the Department of Commerce, it's like an ongoing issue. And so no different for Department of Health and Human Services.
Well, that's exactly what I was just going to mention. I mean, it feels like Groundhog's Day. We just talked about this yesterday with the Commerce Department, another entity within the state receiving large sums of federal monies, Teresa, that are not following these federal guidelines. Yesterday it was a decent chunk of change, but this morning we're talking over $100 million. Now, obviously, again, not indicating necessarily that there's any fraud there, but if there was major fraud, that money would have to be paid back out of the state coffers, would it not?
Yes, it would. Yes, it would. So yeah, it's a pretty big deal when you get down to it.
Now, when we covered the Commerce Department audit yesterday, we had the Commerce Department coming out and saying, yep, we understand that there are these issues. These are some of the things we're changing. We had some key staffing positions that were not filled. Did we get any response from the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services as to what they thought on this audit or any potential changes that they're going to be making?
Yeah. So for that specific, the monitoring of what we just mentioned, they told auditors they are making changes as they clarify staff roles, refine their processes, and train newly hired contract administrators. And they're doing some other work as well. So they said they did agree with it and the findings and the recommendations. But they also said the monitoring plan was not implemented due to competing priorities and changes to the monitoring procedures that were not reflected in the monitoring plan. They also said there were so many different Medicaid people who qualified for Medicaid under Medicaid expansion that there was just an unprecedented influx of service-related dollars. So it basically seemed like there was too much information for them to handle. It's if you read between the lines.
It's interesting as I read through some of the details on this story over at CarolinaJournal.com this morning, Teresa. A lot of this deals with money that is awarded to sub-awards is what they call it, individuals in which DHHS essentially is funneling the money through. So these are outside entities that are taking in this federal monies under this state department that they're not, in some cases, not monitoring the money at all.
Right. That's correct. Even some, like we mentioned about deficiencies in Medicaid eligibility determination process. And I think they did this in the last statewide audit. They were putting the blame on some of the county offices, and it seems like this is happening again. But auditors said even though eligibility is determined by the county departments or Division of Social Services, it's NCDHHS that's responsible for ensuring that compliance with the eligibility requirements. So even though the county is handling it, it's up to the Department of Health.
We're headed back to Heist Brewery and Barrel Arts on Wednesday, April the 16th from 7 to 9 p.m. for WBT's News and Brews, and we'd love to see you there. All of your WBT friends will be in attendance to raise a glass with you and talk about the news and issues of the day. It's WBT's News and Brews, Wednesday, April the 16th at Heist Brewery and Barrel Arts. Visit WBT.com this morning for tickets and event details. Turning our attention back to the North Carolina General Assembly this morning, the Senate earlier this week passed legislation to create a state department to tackle government waste and efficiency. But a separate House proposal to expand the state auditor's authority is raising questions over its scope and potential impact on private entities that receive public dollars. The DAVE Act, we've talked about this over the last couple of weeks, passed the Senate floor on Tuesday in a 29-17 vote with support of all Republicans and one Democrat. The proposal would establish the Division of Accountability, Value, and Efficiency, DAVE, within State Auditor Dave Bolick's office. The bill requires each state agency to report to the division on how it spends taxpayer funds and details all positions that have been vacant for at least the last 6 months. The state auditor will then report back to the General Assembly about whether any state agency or offices should be dissolved and whether any positions should be eliminated. At the time, the leader of the North Carolina Senate, Phil Berger, said, quote, "Funds sent to state agencies come out of the pockets of North Carolinians. Requiring a review of state agency operations and staffing is the right thing to do to ensure that those tax dollars are not wasted." The General Assembly would make final decisions on any needed cuts and changes based on the state auditor's review. During a committee meeting last week, Berger said that the bill would need to be incorporated into the budget, but it calls for the creation of additional positions within the auditor's office. Co-sponsor Senator Steve Jarvis, the Republican out of Davis County, said, quote, "Empowering the state auditor's office to do a full deep dive into state spending will shed light on what is going on and what isn't working in our state agencies. In an era of increased focus on efficiency, this review will do a lot to help reassure our citizens that their tax dollars are being put where they need to." Democrats offered amendments and comments in oppositions to the bill during floor debate, arguing that the effort would force people out of their jobs. Senator Sophia Chintlin out of Durham County said, quote, "Are we creating an environment that encourages retention, or are we pushing people out by making them justify their jobs and their department, which this bill does? And what exactly has Elon Musk and Doge done? Our state and our state employees deserve better than that." The bill now awaits consideration in the House, where another proposal to give the state auditor additional authority was also advanced amid bipartisan concerns. House Bill 548 would give the auditor broader access to state agency databases, digital records, facilities, and properties. Access would also be extended to private entities handling public funds or involved in government programs, which would mean any entity that receives state or federal funds would be subject to a review of the state auditor. Supporters of rooting out fraud and abuse through the DAVE Act have raised questions over the broad House proposal. They say that the proposal structure could threaten to undermine public-private partnerships for farmers to churches and hospitals, with countless entities accepting federal or state funds in terms of subsidies, shelters, things like Medicaid, Medicare, which means the auditor would be allowed to look into their financial dealings. We'll continue to track this legislation as it makes its way forward in the General Assembly. You can read some additional details on our website, carolinajournal.com, and of course, we'll keep you up to date right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour, where it's now 5:24, News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. Keeping an eye on your money this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour, we've got yet another audit out of State Auditor Dave Bolick's office, this time the North Carolina Department of Public Safety, NCDPS. And I guess the headline really says it all. They didn't fully understand some of the requirements behind the money they were getting. To walk us through those details this morning, Teresa Opeka, CarolinaJournal.com, joins us on the News Hour. Teresa, pretty strong headline there. What are the details?
Sure, Nick, thanks so much. So yeah, that was the wording coming out of State Auditor Bolick's office. And again, it's part of the 2024 statewide single audit. So what auditors did, they reviewed cash receipts and disbursement reports in all 12 quarterly federal financial reports and found the amounts reported did not agree with the department's accounting records. And this is going to Hurricane Florence, Hurricane Matthew reports. So here we go again. We're mentioning all this stuff again when it comes to those hurricanes that were almost a decade later. So what they said is reporting inaccurate CDBG, that's Community Development Block Grant financial data, prevents HUD from monitoring the federal funds used to help the communities provide housing and expand economic opportunities for low and moderate income families. So management from Department of Public Safety said the federal financial report was prepared using amounts from HUD's disaster report grant reporting system. It's a mouthful. And the amounts were not reconciled to DPS's accounting records due to a lack of understanding of the reporting requirements. This is what they told the auditors, that they did not understand the reporting requirements. And so, basically auditors recommended that maybe you should understand the requirements, including reconciling the amounts for accuracy. They agreed, DPS agreed with the findings and recommendations and said their controller's office and North Carolina Office of Resiliency and Recovery, better known as NCORE, were unaware of changes in reporting requirements, and management's currently seeking some guidance from HUD to better understand those requirements. So, yeah, they just did not understand what they were looking at. That's not good.
No, I guess trying to plead ignorance there, but I mean, just looking at one of these specifically, it says 4 Hurricane Matthew disaster reports had underreported receipts of almost $9 million and disbursements were underreported by over $13 million. Teresa, that's $22 million that we're talking about there. That is not a small sum of money at all.
No, it is not. I mean, you don't want any sum of money to be reported correctly, but when you're talking that many millions of dollars, I mean, if you don't understand something, maybe you can ask a question. Whether they say there's no stupid question, so go ahead and ask. I mean, but when you're handling federal money and how this all relates to, hurricanes and hurricane victims and hurricane recovery, it's just not a good look for that department.
Now, when some of the other audits that we've talked about earlier this morning and yesterday, there was some discussion taking place that, or the past audits had shown a similar situation unfolding where the same department has been dinged year over year in these statewide single audit that is conducted, and the same problem continued to exist. Is that the same situation over at DPS, or because those requirements just changed, it hasn't been an issue in the past?
Well, they've had some, they were the subject of past audits from this past December and April of 2022, not related to this specific, when you're talking about these guidelines, but they have been the subject of other audits. So it's not like it's their first time at the rodeo at this. So.
Now, I guess it's probably important to maybe broaden the scope a little bit on this, Teresa. There's a lot of discussion going on in Washington, D.C. right now. We've heard about the Department of Government Efficiency. It's been on folks' news feeds now for the last couple of months. Here in North Carolina, the aptly named DAVE Act has been introduced and is working its way through the General Assembly, talking about government efficiency in North Carolina. It seems like with everything that we've been covering over the last few days, this level of efficiency and understanding processes and making sure that things are accounted for correctly is very much needed across North Carolina's government.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It always has been, but you're seeing the light shining on this really, really brightly, now following the Trump administration. Now you've got Auditor Bullock and the NCGA, General Assembly taking a look at all of this and getting some bills hopefully passed. And yeah, it's truly, it's a good thing to shine the light on all of this and not waste money, because, it is all, it boils down to it. It's taxpayer money. You and I and everybody else, we're paying for all of this. So you want to make sure everything is being managed correctly.
No question about that. Teresa, you've got some additional details in the story this morning. Where can folks find those?
They can head on over to carolinajournal.com.
Teresa Opeka joins us this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Where it's now 5:30, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Time for another look at the roadways on a Thursday morning. A look at traffic with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick. Near the airport.
It's 5:37. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good Thursday morning to you. WBT and Tommy D Productions presents George Norrie Live. Saturday, April the 19th, 5 to 8 p.m. at the Booth Playhouse in Charlotte. The legendary George Norrie from Coast to Coast AM will lead an interactive evening featuring special guests Vincent Jania, Samantha Fay, and Danian Brinkley. The show will include questions and answers for George as well as his guests, a salute to our country's military veterans and first responders, and George will even sing some songs with a live band. To top it all off, Bo Thompson and Pete Callender will also be there to say hello. It's all presented in part locally by Monica, the medium, at the Healing Tree Boutique, who will also be on site offering readings for a special price. It's George Norrie Live, Saturday, April 19th at the Booth Playhouse. Visit WBT.com this morning for tickets and details. Turning our attention to some more ongoings here across North Carolina politics this morning. A 3-judge federal panel has dismissed challenges to over 20 legislative and congressional districts in 2 consolidated redistricting lawsuits here across North Carolina. The panel rejected claims that some districts had too many or too few voters and struck down challenges due to legal standing, as plaintiffs didn't live or have any members living in those districts that they sought to challenge. The first lawsuit, William v. Hall and North Carolina State Conference of NAACP versus Berger, both of those, allege racial gerrymandering and voter dilution. The court agreed with Republican legislative leaders that some of the plaintiffs' challenges were invalid. However, they allowed others to move forward. Districts removed from the lawsuit include State Districts 7, 38, and 39, and 42, as well as House Districts 4, 11, 21, 33, 36, 38, 41, 49, 66, 72, 74, 75, and 91, as well as Congressional District 9. The judges ruled that the plaintiffs lacked standing in those areas. However, the court did uphold the plaintiffs' right to challenge other districts, including Senate District 1, 2, 8, 40, and 41, as well as several House districts and congressional districts 1, 5, 6, 10, 12, and 14. Those are federal congressional districts there. The panel also dismissed 2 claims of malappropriation, ruling that plaintiffs failed to show that minor population deviations were due to improper motives or led to systematic partisan advantages in some of those districts. The case is now set to go to trial in June. That will take place in the Winston-Salem area. Any successful challenges could require the General Assembly to redraw maps for the 2026 elections. There's been a lot of redistricting, a lot of map drawing that has taken place in North Carolina over the last 5+ years. We'll track this lawsuit and continue to provide details as we get closer to that June timeline when that case actually makes its way to a federal court there in Winston-Salem. Turning our attention back to the GA this morning, the North Carolina House Committee on Emergency Management and Disaster Recovery has advanced a pretty important piece of legislation that would allow family members to legally declare a loved one dead sooner if they are declared missing following a natural disaster. This is still so heart-wrenching. Approximately 5 people still remain missing since Hurricane Helene devastated portions of western North Carolina back in September of last year. One of the victims still considered missing is Alena Ayers, a 31-year-old from Mitchell County who was swept away with her husband during the storm. Though her husband's body was recovered downstream in Tennessee, her body has not yet been found despite the efforts of law enforcement and volunteers. Alena is presumed dead, but state law, as it's currently written, requires 7 years of waiting before a death declaration can become official. Representative Dudley Green out of Avery County, one of the counties hit incredibly hard from Helene, says, quote, "As you know, we often pass legislation here that impacts the daily lives of millions of people through our state. House Bill 537 isn't one of those, but it may have a big impact on a handful of families that it will affect. We have named it Alena's Law to honor Alena Ayers, who was tragically lost when floodwaters from Hurricane Helene engulfed her home." So it's House Bill 537, and it targets the current 7-year waiting period in cases where a person is presumed dead after events like hurricanes or floods. The legal change would help grieving families resolve critical matters such as estate settlements, child custody, and insurance claims without years of legal uncertainty, upwards of potentially 7 years. Representative Green added on by saying some 5 people remain missing in Helene's aftermath, and the passage of 537 would allow their families to pursue these final things, including child custody, insurance claims, and resolve other issues needed to restore some sense of normalcy in their lives. Alena's cousin, Kelly White, spoke emotionally before the committee, sharing her experience searching for her cousin and calling the bill a, quote, bright light for families left in limbo. Kelly White, the cousin, said, quote, I've spent 4 months looking for her, working with volunteers and law enforcement. And obviously we may not find her, but I think this is a positive change and a bright light that can help other people. And I'm honored that he agreed, talking about Representative Green, agreed to name it only in his after his cousin, because she was a wonderful person and she would want to help other people like she always did, end quote. The committee gave the legislation a favorable report. It now moves on to the House Judiciary 1 Committee for further consideration. Again, as it was referenced by Representative Green in his comments, not going to have an impact for millions of individuals across the state of North Carolina. However, for the families that are still reeling with the loss, the devastation, the destruction of Hurricane Helene, Alena's law does move this morning. It has moved out of the House Committee on Emergency Management and Disaster Recovery. We'll track its progress through the House. Of course, it will have to go through the Senate as well. We'll keep an eye on all of those details right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. It's now 5:44 in News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. We'll get another look at traffic this morning with the great Boomer Von Cannon.
Thank you.
Good morning again. It's 5:51. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. It's been a busy week in the North Carolina General Assembly. We go back there this morning where lawmakers are continuing to go after diversity, equity, and inclusion programs in state government and public universities. The push to ban DEI initiatives, of course, part of a national broader push by Republican politicians to crack down on policies that they say have gone too far and are now discriminating against individuals. The efforts come in the wake of a successful push by various groups on the right in a lawsuit that revolved around UNC Chapel Hill to also ban affirmative action in the universities across the country. Yesterday, it was the state Senate that voted to ban DEI in community colleges and throughout the UNC system as well. The state house was scheduled for a second straight day to vote on a DEI ban in all state and local agencies, but the GOP leaders had to delay that vote for a second day. The vote in the Senate did come down along party lines, with Republicans in support and Democrats opposing that ban taking place in Senate Bill 558. Senator Brad Overcash, the Republican out of Gaston County, said during the debate yesterday, quote, "In recent years, discriminatory practices and divisive concepts have entered into our institutions of higher learning. They've divided our campuses, they've divided our student bodies, as well as dividing our faculty. Supporters of banning DEI programs note that they are not opposed to diversity in general. They just don't think that state government should have formal pro-diversity training programs for employees, any quotas or other DEI policies involving decisions about hiring, practices, or admission within the state-run systems." Democrats on the other side, however, are very critical of this. They claim that DEI policies don't encourage discrimination, but rather help avoid it. Senator Greg Meyer, the Democrat out of Orange County, said, quote, "The work of diversity, equity, and inclusion is taking the actions to ensure that every person, meaning inclusion, no matter who they are, meaning diversity, is given what they need to be successful. That's equality. The best leaders frame all of their work through a lens that reinforces those three values." During Wednesday's debate over the proposal to ban DEI in higher education, Overcash said it simply wasn't about refocusing school on merit and academic excellence alone, with no consideration of any other qualities. Senator Greg Myers, responded by proposing an amendment to the bill that would eliminate legacy admissions at all public universities in North Carolina, a rule that has given children of alumni legs up in admission. Meyer said, quote, "Consideration of legacy in higher education admissions is the single most inequitable factor influencing who gets access to our institutions of higher education. This would undo the most historically unjust piece of our institutions of higher education. If you truly mean what you say in the bill, I would encourage you to approve this amendment." While Republicans not taking the bait on that, they voted down his amendment with no explanation or no debate. They also shot down a more mocking amendment from Senator Lisa Grafstein, the Democrat out of Wake County, who suggested that Republicans, that if they were going to pass the DEI ban, they should at least change the official name of the bill. Her suggestion was, quote, "An act to do absolutely nothing useful while failing to address the growing challenges of our higher education institutions face in the wake of the disastrous education policies of the NCGOP. The dismantling of the U.S. Department of Education, rescinding NIH grants, and general chaos brought forth by the Trump administration for the purposes of attacking freedom on campuses and creating a chilling effect on colleges, universities, and their administrators, professors, students, and staffs." As you can imagine, that very pointed name suggestion was very quickly and immediately shot down by Republicans in the General Assembly. Despite grandstanding from Democrats in Raleigh, the legislation did pass the Senate completely. Senate Bill 558 has now officially moved in the Senate. We now turn our attention to the House, where House Bill 171 has been discussed over the last couple of days. That piece of legislation would ban DEI policies and trainings in all state and local government agencies. It was initially scheduled for a vote earlier this week on Tuesday. House Speaker Destin Hall pulled it off the calendar at the last minute and rescheduled the vote to take place on Wednesday, where once again he announced at the last minute that the vote would be postponed yet again. Each time the decision came as protesters packed the House gallery. Although Hall said the cancellation votes had nothing to do with protesters, the bill's sponsors were continuing to work on tweaks within the bill, however, declined to give specifics to media across the state. GOP leaders have agreed to some changes, however, in recent weeks on the legislation, making the bill less aggressive in its enforcement, a sticking point for some opponents. The original House bill focused on state agencies and would have made violations a criminal offense. However, the latest version makes it only a disciplinary infraction for state workers that are caught taking place in DEI policies. And the Senate bill originally would have banned colleges and universities and any other groups that are providing public education, would ban any sort of conversation about those taking place on campus. House Majority Leader Brandon Jones, the Republican from Columbus County, is a lead sponsor of the bill and has said taking an aim at DEI in state and local government is a very important practice here for the General Assembly. We'll continue to track this legislation as it makes its way through both the House and the Senate. We'll keep you up to date on CarolinaJournal.com. That's going to do it for a Thursday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour. WBT News is next, followed by Good Morning BT. We're back with you tomorrow morning, 5 to 6, right here on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT.